much to the organizers for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to be part of an ECGI event, and also to be in Tokyo, which is probably my most favorite city in the world, or definitely very high up there. All right, so this paper is co-authored with Amir Licht, and this is one of the papers that Gerard said it takes about 5 years to write a paper. I'm hoping that this won't be a 10-year paper, but it might get close to that. And actually, I have to thank the organizers for inviting me to present this paper, because it gave me a big push to actually do some work on it. So it's a bit of a work in progress. And in particular, as you see, there's a work in progress sign there. The title is definitely a work in progress. So you see many papers nowadays called something something around the world. I'm not a big fan of the around the world, so we're going to change that, especially because around the world usually means like 15 countries. And so how representative is it really? Usually not so much. All right. So the motivation, I think, was made a lot easier for me because at the recent Global Corporate Governance Colloquium, of which ECGI is an active participant, in Stockholm, at which many of the current presenters were also present, Oliver Hart gave a very interesting speech with Luigi Zingales. And what was his speech about? The question was, is the responsibility of business to pursue shareholder value? And this raised a lot of controversy. So this was probably the most active session of the entire conference. And it came at the very end, and people would have stayed and continued to discuss this issue because a lot of people were saying, of course, the responsibility of business is to pursue shareholder value, but if Oliver Hart says maybe not, then people might listen, right? So, and the answer that Oliver Hart and Luigi Zingales gave was that if shareholders have concerns other than money, they have ethical concerns, for example, the answer may be no. And their argument was that in some cases it may be easier to pursue non-financial interests through the corporation than doing it separately, which is the standard argument. You say, well, why should the company engage in philanthropy, for example? You can just donate money to charities. Well, their answer was maybe companies have an easier time of engaging in philanthropy, and so therefore it may be more efficient to do it through the company than to do it separately. So this was a very interesting talk, and definitely helps motivate the paper that I'm presenting. And we could just end it right there, because what more do I have to add to what Oliver Hart says? Maybe not so much. Let's see. Am I clicking at the right thing? Okay, so, but it's not just Oliver Hart who says that potentially stakeholders are interesting. In finance, corporate social responsibility is a hot topic. But I would argue that most finance papers tend to take a little bit of a simplistic view, and excuse me if I'm stepping on your toes here, but a lot of papers just download this KLD database, which presumably you might have seen. KLD is a consulting company. They go out, they rank companies on their social responsibility, and people take the data, they download it, and then they run a bunch of regressions, right? Which may have some value in some sense. So there's a firm-level data set that people look at, or people look at shareholder responsibility at the firm level. There's also country-level measures of shareholder responsibility. For example, people look at co-determination. So if you have employees represented on the board, presumably you care more about stakeholders, in particular employees. But the Hart and Zingales paper, which something that I found very interesting, was that they highlighted that personal beliefs are actually important. Okay, so in particular, their argument was that if shareholders care about other things, so that sort of points to individual values being important. So it's not just about the country, it's not just about firms, it's about what do individuals actually believe. That might be important. Okay, so in their discussion, they were talking about ethical concerns. This is an individual characteristic, right? It's not a firm level or country level characteristic. They were talking about shareholder interests. So this is, again, an individual characteristic. they were talking about, well, founders might want to include mission statements in their corporate charters. So that means something specific to the founder. The values of the founder might need to be reflected in mission statements of companies. So what we do is we take a very individualistic approach to stakeholder orientation. So we survey directors of listed companies in 23 countries, so definitely not around the world, in 23 countries. And the key measures of interest in our study are attitudes towards stakeholders and shareholders. We look at personal values, and I'll describe how we measure them in a second. And we look at personal characteristics. Okay, the questions that we ask are, first, do directors vary in their attitudes towards stakeholders? Now, we think this is sort of interesting because we also talk about the fiduciary duty to shareholders, and you may be in a country where the same law applies to everyone, but not only lawyers or academics may interpret the law differently, but directors may also interpret the law differently. And then the question is, well, what determines how they interpret the law, right? One person may say, well, we care more, like in this particular situation, we should act in the interests of shareholders and we're satisfying our fiduciary duty. The other person may have a slightly different view of whether or not they're satisfying their fiduciary duty. So do directors vary in their attitudes towards stakeholders, even within the same legal regime? What, if any, role do personal values play? So if it's not just the law or the corporate culture that determines your attitudes towards stakeholders, is it something specific to the individual that matters? What, if any, role do personal characteristics play? And what, if any, role does culture play? Okay, so some tentative answers. Do directors vary in their attitudes towards stakeholders? And the answer is yes. So they do vary. There's variation across individuals, even within the same legal regime. What, if any, role do personal values play? They play a seemingly important role, and I'll explain later exactly which values we look at. But there seems to be a consistent pattern in the relationship between individually held values and directors' stances towards stakeholders or shareholders. What, if any, role do personal characteristics play? It seems that women are generally more stakeholder-oriented than men. So that sort of suggests that there may be a role. So in Oliver Hart's world, maybe women will become more important. And what, if any, role does culture play? It also seems to matter. So some tentative findings are that there's a negative correlation between, and there's a typo there, it should be shareholder attitudes and labor protection and trust. So if you're in a country where there's a lot of protection for labor, you as a director on average also care more for stakeholders and less for shareholders. So it seems that societal values are reflected in individual directors' values. Okay. So why is this important? Well, I think we don't really understand yet very well why executives do what they do, right? So the same person may be in one situation, or two different people in the same situation may make different decisions. Why is it the case? Even though we have the same law, the same corporate setup, and we need to understand a little bit more about why executives do what they do. And also we need to understand, are there limits to policy and law and institutions, right? So at some point, how you interpret the law as an individual director may matter. How you respond to your culture may matter. And the idea of culture being important came up earlier today. Can one change culture? This came up in the sovereign wealth discussion. Not so clear, right? Maybe you can't change culture, but we need to understand what role culture plays in order to see where we need to direct policy. And if we actually decide that CSR is important, how do we implement it, right? So obviously, if we decide that CSR is very important, we should just have all women running companies, and then all the men can go home. Okay, so some background. We're building, I'll show you some of the more recent results, but we're building on a paper that was published in 2011 where we surveyed directors in Sweden, and we did basically the same thing. So we surveyed directors on their attitudes towards stakeholders and shareholders, their values, and their personal characteristics. Now, Sweden is a great country to do surveys in because first you can figure out the entire population of directors, and Swedes like to answer surveys. So we surveyed the entire population of directors. We had a questionnaire that had like 80 questions, and our response rate was like 36%. So it's an amazing sample. Okay, so how did we survey them on their attitudes towards stakeholders or shareholders? So what we did, my co-author is a lawyer, so if the lawyers don't like what we did here, we can blame him. But I actually think this is a very clever idea. So basically what we did is we confronted directors in a survey with vignettes that were derived from seminal court cases. And these court cases involved clear conflicts between shareholders and stakeholders. Okay? And the four particular cases that we looked at were a case that involved shareholders versus consumers. That's the Dodge versus Ford 1919 case. There's a case that involved employees versus shareholders, Park versus Daily News. A case involving creditors versus shareholders, and a case involving the community versus shareholders. And in the discussion today, I was thinking, well, we should have also had a case about the government versus shareholders, but I'm not sure if there is a seminal case on this yet. So if you do have any suggestions for how we could expand the list, that would be great. And then we also had a corporate philosophy question. So this was not derived from a legal case, but we built on a previous paper that surveyed individuals on corporate philosophy. Okay, so let me just briefly describe, for example, the Dodge versus Ford. So basically, I'll just read you from the paper, from the previous paper. So basically, the case looks somewhat like this. Thanks to its dominant position in the automobile industry, the Ford Motor Company had a very large surplus fund. Henry Ford wanted the firm to use these funds in a way that would benefit consumers and also employees. In court, he testified, "I only want to make a small profit for my corporation." The court had, in quotes, "no doubt that certain sentiments, philanthropic and altruistic, creditable to Mr. Ford, had large influence in determining the policy to be pursued." The court nonetheless held that a business corporation is organized and carried on primarily for the profit of the stockholders. The powers of the director are to be employed for that end. So basically the case here involved Ford wanting to use some of the funds to reduce prices to benefit consumers, and the court ruling that that was against shareholder interests and saying that that couldn't be done. Okay, so how do we actually implement it? So in the survey, we don't say, well, this is the Dodge versus Ford case, okay? So we try to strip all the context away from the vignette. And we confront directors. It looks something like this. So here, the Dodge versus Ford, sorry, that's not 1991, it's 1919. So there's 9 and the 1 are flipped. So we say Corporation F is a manufacturer of consumer goods. Despite considerable competition, Corporation F is highly profitable thanks to patented technology and manufacturing know-how. In recent years, the company has been paying out only small amounts as regular dividends. The company now contemplates ways for using its very high capital surplus. Suppose you were a director in F, to what extent would you agree with the following propositions? So the first proposition is the company should reduce the price of its products to benefit consumers. So that's what Ford wanted to do. And the second is distribute virtually all of its undistributed profits to its shareholders. That's basically what the court wanted to do. And the importance, so directors receive this vignette, and we ask them, well, which statement do you agree with, right? How would you decide? And you have to answer both, right? And you answer from strongly agree to strongly disagree, how you would decide, okay? Now, the important thing about these cases is there's no middle ground, right? So either you're for the consumers or you're for the shareholders, okay? So we surveyed the directors on these legal cases, and then we also had a question that asked about corporate philosophy, and this comes from Tetlock. And so this is basically about which statement would you like to have on your website about your corporate philosophy. So it reads like this: Corporation X is considering updating its website. A consultant proposes to post one of the following statements under corporate philosophy as a statement from the board of directors. Suppose you're a director in X, to what extent would you agree with the following propositions? And then the first one is, we believe that our corporation should have one overriding purpose: to create value for shareholders, blah, 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 blah. And the second one is, we believe that our corporation should strive to achieve a variety of sometimes conflicting goals. So this one is very shareholder-oriented. This one is more stakeholder-oriented. Okay, so we have the shareholder, the stakeholder measures. So we survey them using these different vignettes. And what we do is we create an index out of the answers. And the index is increasing the more you say that you're interested in shareholders. And the opposite is true. So if it goes down, that means you care more about stakeholders. Okay. Now, the other key things that we look at are personal values. And these, we're taking the values from Schwartz. And these are basically values or conceptions of the desirable that transcend certain situations. They're supposed to measure sort of intrinsic beliefs that people hold. And there's 10 value types. Not sure if you can see this here, but there's achievement, power, security, conformity, tradition, benevolence, universalism, self-direction, stimulation, and hedonism. Okay, and we hypothesize that these values are systematically related to directors' attitudes towards shareholders versus stakeholders. Okay, a very easy one, probably to understand, is the more universalism oriented you are, that means the more you care about society, that's what universalism essentially reflects. We hypothesize that the less shareholder-oriented, the more stakeholder-oriented you might be. Okay. We also hypothesize that the more power and achievement-oriented you are, the more shareholder-oriented you might be. Okay. I'm not sure you can see this. Let me just walk you through some of the most important things. So as usual, we have our hypotheses, and our evidence is consistent with all of our hypotheses, which is always very good, right? Okay, so what do we find? So basically the regressions here are how shareholder-oriented you are. So it increases in shareholder orientation. And here we have the values, and we have some individual characteristics. Okay. So the values basically go the way that we expect. For example, the more universalist you are, the less you care about shareholders, the more you care about stakeholders. Now, in Sweden, you have employee representatives on the board, and we have a fair number represented in our sample. Employee representatives are consistently less shareholder-oriented than the other directors. Does it make sense? I would say it does, right? Men tend to be more shareholder-oriented. That means women are more stakeholder-oriented. And older directors tend to be more stakeholder-oriented, less shareholder-oriented. Okay. So that's the original paper. Now we extend this outside Sweden, because obviously you could say, well, this is just a Sweden effect, right? Is it interesting for other jurisdictions? And so we did an international version of this survey. This is why it takes like 5 years, 10 years, maybe 15 years, hopefully not. But it was an email-driven online survey, and it's very tricky if you do this around the world because you have to translate the surveys and make sure that it all makes sense. And we have some of the same vignettes. We have the Ford versus Dodge, Park versus Daily News. We have a new creditor vignette because we decided the other one didn't translate well to different jurisdictions. And we have the same community vignette and the same corporate philosophy vignette. The value questions are the same, and we also ask for individual characteristics. So basically, we end up with 23 countries across a variety. So we have Australia, Austria, Canada, Germany. We have Jordan, but only 4 responses. So 8 from Korea, 7 from Kuwait, Saudi Arabia 5, so US 462. So it's around the world, but not really around the world, right? Because some responses, we can't really do much with 3 responses from Malaysia. Okay. So 11% of our sample is female, and on average, directors are 56. This is about right. That's a typical age for directors. And here, this is, sorry for the mnemonics, it's not very intelligible, but this is our index of shareholderism, so how shareholder-oriented you are. And I guess one thing that's interesting to see is, there is variation. So the mean, it's on a scale from 1 to 6. The mean is 3.5, which is sort of already interesting. It's not 6, right? It's not every director who says we should always be in favor of shareholders, right? So the mean is 3.5. Well, that's sort of potentially already quite interesting. The standard deviation is 0.82, so there's variation. And it goes from a minimum of 1 to maximum of 5.8. Okay, so some preliminary results. So very surprisingly, because this never happens, the values all lined up exactly as in Sweden. So I'm like, there must be something wrong with the data because this is really impossible. So power, the more power-oriented directors are, the more they cared about shareholders. The more universalism-oriented they were, the less they cared about shareholders, and the more they cared about stakeholders. Now there's a coding error. The women, so here it looks like the women are more shareholder-oriented. In the Swedish study, we had the women are less shareholder-oriented, but there's a coding error here. So this is pretty amazing. So the results are quite consistent, and we even have country effects, and in some cases, country of origin of the director fixed effects. Okay, now most of the countries don't have very many responses. So here I just put the shareholderism values for the countries with greater than 20 observations, and I ranked them by low shareholder orientation to high shareholder orientation. So this is sort of interesting. So among the countries with greater than 20 observations, Switzerland has the lowest shareholder orientation. UK, US are sort of in the middle. And here we have India and South Africa with the greatest shareholder orientation. I'm not totally sure if that was what I was expecting, but it's interesting, right? Because you look at Switzerland, Australia, Canada, Germany, you might say, okay, lots of very good labor protection, and in these countries, and those are the countries where directors feel that stakeholders are more important relative to shareholders. So this already sort of suggests, okay, there is a cultural component to directors' attitudes. So now what I did is I just regressed. These are just simple correlations. So you regress shareholderism on measures of labor protection. And I'm sorry again for these don't make much sense. But the ones that are significant, so here this is an index of how good disclosure is in the country. So countries with better disclosure, in those countries, directors are more shareholder-oriented. In countries with better labor protection, that's what these variables measure, directors are more stakeholder-oriented, less shareholder-oriented. So that reflects basically what I showed you before, just in a different way, right? So more labor protection is associated with more stakeholder orientation of directors. So it seems that the culture is reflected in directors' attitudes. Here we have countries in which in which individuals say that they trust each other more, care more about stakeholders, and less about shareholders. Sorry, directors in countries where people say that they trust each other more, care more about stakeholders rather than shareholders. And these are measures essentially of development. So the less developed you are, the more you care about shareholders, which is sort of also an interesting finding. Now this is all very preliminary, right? This is just taking the raw data and seeing, well, what does the raw data say? But it does suggest that culture matters for individual directors' attitudes. Okay, so what can we conclude? Well, first of all, it's always good to see that you take a different data set and you do something that you've done before, you don't get exactly the opposite, right? So here, we don't get exactly the opposite. So the patterns in our previous paper, the Adams, Licht, and Sagiv, where we only looked at Sweden, it seems are not just a Sweden effect. Okay, so that's good. We think that the findings suggest that personal values appear to matter. Okay, and again, I think the interesting, interpretation of this is that, okay, so even if you're in the same legal system, directors will interpret the law differently, right? And culture appears to matter. So then, when you think about policy implications, changing governance, we have to think about culture, right? Can one change culture? If we can't change culture, how does one circumvent culture if necessary? What are the implications? Well, I think one implication is that diversity may matter, right? So maybe you need people who come from different cultures, for example, on the board. There's some literature on the role of foreign directors. People tend to say, well, foreign directors are not so good, but actually maybe foreign directors can be good. Having different people from different cultures may be good if culture is really important and affects individual attitudes. Also, this idea that everyone has the same sort of priors, I think our evidence shows that people may have different priors, right? So you're in the same legal system, people interpret it differently, right? So when it comes to group decision making, how do people make decisions if they have different priors? That's sort of an interesting question. So group decision making may be much more complex than we generally give boards credit for. Now, one thing I have to say is, unfortunately, we don't have more than one director on a board answering the survey. So how individual values aggregate to the group level is a whole another area that is very interesting for future research, but we don't yet know how that happens. So right now, we basically tend to have one person on different boards. So what we can say is across boards, individuals have different values. But how does it work within a board? It's not clear yet. All right, thanks very much.